Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shaw, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Ed Darris.
Hey,
Hello.
Good evening, fellas. Today we are reviewing Highrise by Jg Ballard, the first book in our series Bad Adaptation, Good Books Made into Bad Films. If this is your first time joining us, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. You can find our discussion there by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can support us and your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link. That's also in our episode description.
Actually updated now.
Yeah. At our bookshop store page, you can find books for our book club and other books that we recommend. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have an in depth discussion of this book. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. So, Ed, this was your pick for our series. Can you tell us a little bit about Jg Ballard?
Ballard is one of those people that is kind of a cult figure, I would say. Whenever I hear of people like that, I'm really intrigued. He's an English writer, often associated with what's called the new wave of science fiction, which started in the 1960s and can be thought of as kind of a move away from space fiction and the pursuit of scientific accuracy. It's more of a move towards experimental or idiosyncratic types of science fiction. He was mostly concerned with the psychological impact of the environment on a human being. He often placed his protagonists in unusual circumstances. For example, in his novel, The Drowned World, we see a scientist's way of life and how it changes in response to massive flooding caused by climate change. Another novel of this kind is Concrete Island, which is about an architect who becomes stranded on a concrete slab in the middle of several intersecting roadways. He is on this slab, and for some reason, he seems unable to move. So it's like a psychological paralysis. We don't understand what's going on. His most famous novel is probably Empire of the Sun, which is a non science fiction work. It's a memoir of Ballard's childhood in Shanghai. He actually was born there and he lived there for the first 16 years of his life. And it's about his time in a Japanese internment camp. That was actually adapted also into a film directed by Steven Spielberg, which was quite critically acclaimed. Because of the way that his novels seem to predict the future, or predict and understand the way that environmental changes affect modern people, some fans have called him the seer of Shepperton. Shepperton is the London suburb where he lived for most of his adult life. And the novel that we're discussing, Highrise, I think understands social hierarchy in modern apartment buildings in a way that's worthy of that title. The protagonist is Robert Lang. He is a divorced doctor and he moves into an apartment on the 25th floor of a brand new 40-floor high rise. He soon begins a romantic relationship with Charlotte Melville, who lives above him, and he also becomes acquainted with Anthony Royal, who is the architect who designed the building, and Royal lives in the penthouse on the top. Lang also becomes acquainted with Richard Wilder, who is a documentary filmmaker who lives on one of the lower floors. In the building, conflict soon breaks out over some bottles that are broken carelessly. The electricity in the building is soon cut off on some of the lower floors, and from there the chaos seems to very rapidly escalate as residents compete for access to some of the high rise building's amenities. They barricade themselves in their apartments, and they even form sort of warring clans on each floor.
I think it's important to note that today's readers of High Rise might have a different understanding of the book than the readers of the book at the time of publication, because a lot of what might have been cutting edge at that time are fairly common today. So, High Rise, for example, was published only 15 years after the construction of the first condo in the US. And even though people were living in apartment buildings at the time, the idea of owning a condo was pretty new and kind of a radical concept because instead of owning your own land and the house that was built on it, it was kind of this co-ownership of a building and of shared space. So this new idea of condo ownership challenged how people thought about ownership and shared space. And then you can couple that with the brutalist architecture that's present in the book. The high rise building is described as a concrete building. I'm pretty sure it's brutalist. It's not very clearly defined as brutalist in the text, but in the movie, it's this kind of
It's very clearly
yeah,
brutalist,
it's
yeah.
very clearly a brutalist building.
But stylized brutalist.
Yeah, because it has that little kind of like a wavy hairstyle at the top, that slopes over a little bit. But yeah, so I mean, brutalist architecture emerged in the 1950s from the UK, actually, I think. And then it became very common by the 70s, especially in government buildings. So this book, I think, if you had read this book at the time, it would have been a comment of the cutting edge technology at that time. These ideas of co-ownership, these ideas of brutalist architecture and what a building is supposed to make you feel and how it's supposed to look. So it's not an idea that we would understand fully now. Like it would have to be something totally different, I think, if we were to try to capture that idea of newness. And also, you see other elements of modernity, like the handheld camcorder, which was invented in the 70s. So in the book, you see technology being presented to us that nowadays we would just think as even old.
All of this kind of talk about, the time frame of the novel versus our time frame when we're reading it is something that I kind of took issue with. I'll talk more about that when we get on to the adaptation of the novel. But at least for the novel itself, I just want to say in general, I liked it a lot. I didn't love it, but I definitely enjoyed it. And I can see why people are so fascinated with Ballard. What works for me most is the ambiguity of the narrative. It deals with a lot of very potent topics, like you mentioned, James, the modern city, middle class life, social stratification, and for all of these things, I think when it comes to social satire, there is kind of a hackneyed or predictable response to those things. There is a predictable scorn that you would expect from most novelists in the middle of the 20th century. What I think makes this novel unique and what makes it interesting to me is that the novel could be focusing on those topics in any number of ways. You could be focusing on the way that living in a high rise engenders a certain sort of behavior or something inside of humanity that is exposed by living in this building, or something wrong with society in general that's exposed by the building. But Ballard doesn't do any of these predictable things. He does all of them, it seems, at once, but also none of them. It seems very difficult to pin him down to any sort of what I would say is a predictable political stance that I think we would be very likely to find in a novel like this written in 2021.
I also really liked the ideas of the novel. I thought that was well presented. It was a little bit too obvious at times. I know what you mean by ambiguity, but the fact that the person at the very top, his name is Royal, it's a little bit on the nose. There's just small instances like that where I just thought, okay, like that's a bit obvious. But aside from that, the engagement on the idea level was fantastic. The one thing I didn't like about this book, on the aesthetic level, I didn't like how the characters, to me, psychologically, didn't make sense. And I think that's part of what he's trying to achieve. But at the same time, for me as a reader, it actually was a struggle for me to get through the book because I just thought, well, I have no idea why this guy is thinking this way. For me, especially the character of Royal, who undergoes, I think, 2 shifts in the book, I just didn't get it. Like, I didn't understand why he would suddenly become this kind of person and then another kind of person. I felt like that happened quite a few times in the book, where people would act in a way that I thought was uncharacteristic, not because, everyone was acting, in an inhumane way or inscrutable way, but it's just like they were established as one kind of person, and then suddenly they became another kind of person. And also thought the treatment of women was kind of problematic because for much of the book, they just, I don't know, like they weren't even real characters. And then at the end of the book, they suddenly became very important characters. It was just kind of uneven, like throughout. And, setting that aside, if I didn't care about any of that on a pure ideas level, I thought this book was very interesting. It's totally the kind of book I would love, this sci fi dystopian novel, but just the way he approached the characters, I found it quite distracting.
Hmm.
I think you're not supposed to care about them as characters.
Yeah.
I think that it's structured with all of these, and this is something that I've heard a lot about his work in general. It's structured with characters as kind of archetypes. They are very clearly flat, but the psychological dimension of the individual protagonist, I think, is central. It's not really important how they relate to each other, but rather how the environment relates to them.
I think my issue with it isn't the fact that they're flat. He just manipulates them. Like he moves them from as a chess piece from one part of the book to another just to have them do something. It just seemed very inorganic to me. Especially for me, it was the character of Royal. That character was the one that really distracted me. The other characters I thought were fine. Like Wilder, he suffered from some of the same issues, but I was more okay with it. It was mainly Royal that I had a problem with. The book has three main points of view: Lang, the physiologist, Wilder, and Royal. Actually, at the beginning of the book, when it was from Lang's point of view, I had no problems with it.
I felt okay with it because of what he had pointed out, that it's kind of archetypal. I don't think we're supposed to see into their minds as real people. So the shifts that we see in their characters have to make some sort of sense, I suppose, but not the way a character reflecting a real person might. The women, I think, is a really interesting point. It bothered me too until it becomes clear why Ballard is treating them the way he is. Because there is a point to how he's treating these women in the book.
Yeah, I agree, but I thought it wasn't a subtle point.
There's not a whole lot of subtlety in the book. As you point out, Richard Wilder, Dick Wilde,
Yeah.
is pretty on the nose name. Royal is a pretty on the nose name.
But I think what is subtle is what you could think of as the conclusion. He set up this novel with some very clear ideas, and the characters are very clearly representing something. They're archetypes, but what is the message or what is the political significance of what he's showing us? And that to me is the ambiguity that I enjoyed so much. Like, does he have a point about living in high rises? Does he have a point about society? What exactly does he mean?
I was also really intrigued by the ambiguity, and we'll get to the movie later, but I think that's one of the reasons why the movie failed for me, is that that ambiguity isn't really there in the movie, or at least not to the same degree. I think the book does have points, even though it's obvious in some ways. Yeah, the ambiguity of what he's saying about high rise living or what he's saying about social stratification, even though there are obvious things about it, I don't think you could easily just point to a moral, so to speak, and say, this is the point.
Maybe not even a moral, just a point of view. Like, I think the expected point of view, if somebody told me about this novel, is that high rises are bad and living in high rises is inhumane. But that's not what the novel delivers at all. In fact,
Yeah.
I think that in some ways, the novel is a celebration of living this way. It's a celebration of an experience that may be necessary for people.
So we'll take a break and talk about the adaptation of this book soon. But before we do, by the way, I'll note that we'll have this on our subreddit. I found an article in the New York Times about a recent high rise that was built just 5 or so years ago that had some similarities to what happened in the novel. I just thought that was a weird, kind of funny occurrence, also kind of sad. But I don't feel too sad about billionaires or really rich people not getting what they paid for. So, yeah, that article about billionaires possibly getting cheated out of their money because they live in a high rise that's falling apart will be linked as well. So, we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the adaptation of high rise. All right, welcome back. So, yeah, can you tell us about the movie that is not such a good adaptation of this book?
The 2015 film adaptation we're going to talk about was a UK production. It's directed by Ben Wheatley from a screenplay by Amy Jump, his wife.
Oh, didn't know they were married.
Yeah. The film stars Tom Hiddleston as Lang, Jeremy Irons as Royal, and Sienna Miller as Charlotte. In my estimation, in very broad terms, the film is faithful to the novel, but I think that there are some tonal shifts and elisions which make it veer quite sharply away from Ballard's vision. The first thing I would say is just to get back to the time frame that you had mentioned earlier, James. I think that the time frame in the film is in the 1970s, and the time frame in the novel is unstated, but it's probably the same as when the novel was published in 1975. And I think that keeping the same time frame ruins the movie to an extent. There is, in my mind, a very substantial difference between a 1975 novel set in the 1970s and a 2015 film set in the 1970s. When we as viewers watch a film in 2021 that's set in the 1970s, there are certain things that we can't help but focus on. And I think when a screenwriter is adapting a novel, the screenwriter needs to decide which elements of the story are deliberate and which are contingent. And for me, I think that the time frame is not a deliberate choice. I think it's just because that's when Ballard wrote the novel. When we look at this film nowadays, we can't help but let the spectacle of the costume and set design make us feel that the year that the novel is set in is more integral to the story than the novel, I think, actually indicates.
I think you're right. I hadn't thought about it that way when I was watching. And I would be interested in seeing a version of the movie that takes place today or, in a vague near future. But even though it does go to a specificity that isn't in the book, putting the movie in the past in the 1970s, it does a couple things. One, it kind of points to the decadence of that time, especially as James pointed out with these new high rises, these new condominiums. Um, but at the same time, because we're looking at it in the past, it removes some of the weight of the movie. By putting the movie in the past, there's a slight hint that this probably wouldn't happen in our future, that this is a mistake of the past, when that's not the point at all, and it's not necessarily even a mistake. I think that specificity robs the story of that ambiguity that you've been talking about, Ed.
I think if we want to have a faithful adaptation of the book, I think it has to be set in present day because for the reasons mentioned before, but also it's about the possibility of new technology and how it might change us. If you set it in the past, you take that point out of the work entirely.
I feel like that was something that was kind of glossed over in the movie too. We see Lang at some point, I wouldn't even say marveling, but looking at his new appliances and admiring things about the building, but it's in a montage. We don't get any of the internal speculations or thoughts of interest at what makes this building special. In fact, we don't get very much about the building itself at all. And the building is so important in the book.
And the modernization could work because the New York Times article I referenced earlier about the tallest high rise in New
Sure.
York was built, I think, the year the film came out. So, new ground is being broken literally when it comes to high rises. And I think it's a bit odd if, you had Walder running around recording stuff on his cell phone. But at the same time, that's kind of the effect of that time. If you had someone at that time, running around with a video recorder on his shoulder, I mean, that's what it was like. It was something that was very cutting edge. And I think even though to us it would be odd to have those two juxtaposed, like someone with a camcorder and someone with a cell phone, I think the effect would be more faithful to what Ballard was trying to do.
Yeah, I think in general, what Wheatley and Jump went for was the style of the novel, but not the spirit of the novel. Because when we see the 1970s in the film, it's not just the 1970s, but it's a very stylized version of it, clearly distinct from a kind of naturalistic depiction of real life. It amplifies the difference between modern times and the 1970s in a distracting way. It keeps you from focusing on the ideas, and it's more the aesthetic medium, the way that the film is presented to you, which I think is fine because it is a film and that's what film can do well, but it's very bad as an adaptation of a work of art.
There are a lot of things that lose their meaning in the translation to the movie, partly because it wasn't done well, but also we'll talk about if you can even make this book into a successful movie later. But there's a logistical problem, which is that the book has a lot more space to unfold. In a movie, you only have, 90 minutes to tell all these stories. So the movie does certain things like eliminate characters or fold multiple characters into one, eliminate certain taboos that happen in the book. And some of that feels necessary because they're trying to streamline the story. But when you're streamlining things that are important and you're streamlining them out of the story, then you get into iffy territory. Not only that, but there were a lot of things that the movie invents on its own, which is fine. He's trying to make it his own. But when the inventions fall flat and don't carry any real meaning, that's when it becomes a problem.
One invention that I'm very mixed on is how his sister plays a key role in the book and the relationship changes, but in the movie, his sister is dead. Like, that's a pretty big change.
Right. Yeah. Um, the role of Charlotte is also very different in the movie. In the book, she's important in the beginning and then not very important in the second half. In the movie, she is very central all the way through. And this is a problem in how she relates to Lang because Lang is treated in the movie as more of a hero all the way through, whereas he is a part of the novel. You can look at him as a hero, but he's not the only central figure in the novel, whereas in the movie, he's kind of the center.
I mean, is this an unavoidable part of big budget filmmaking, though? Because when you have this screenplay and you really want to cast Sienna Miller as Charlotte, you're going to get the big name
Right.
actress by promising her a lot of screen time. And if that means changing the story, you change the story to get the actress to get the views, right? That to me seems part of, big studio filmmaking that is in many ways incompatible with the type of storytelling that Ballard would want.
Well, that's kind of my point, is that you can streamline things if it works. I mean, clearly, this movie, even though it was a flop in that it didn't make back what it cost, there were a number of critics that really loved it. But I was trying to think of whether I would like this movie if I hadn't read the book. I think I would have had less problems with it, but it's still such a mess that I think I still would have had a lot of problems with it.
What I think makes it really thin is the montage in the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
It really removes all of that ambiguity that I love so much. It replaces a very central part of the novel, which is the descent into chaos, with a very kind of thin reading, which is not very attractive, even just as a work of film. In the novel, we can understand the steps along the way as the building descends into chaos. And it begins as very straightforward sort of class conflict when the people on the upper floors are mistreating the people on the lower floors. But more things happen. And in the film, basically, there is this class conflict, and then the montage starts. And because it's a montage, the way a viewer looks at it is this is more of the same. And it reduces all of the complication of the novel to class conflict, which really simplifies the whole thing. It makes it boring, actually, which is the opposite of what a montage should do.
And one of the examples of the montage being a problem comes at the first couple minutes of the movie, where in the book, we get an image of Lang eating a dog and wondering how his life had come to this in the last 3 months. In the first couple minutes of the movie, we do have that scene of Lang eating this dog, but then we also get images of some of the crazy, gory, violent things happening that don't happen until much, much later, and you're spoiled to them. It makes it cheap. It makes it a spectacle rather than a message about something.
You know, when I started the book, I thought that was cheap. I didn't like it.
I found it interesting because it's the first thing you see. It immediately makes you sit up and go, "What is this?"
I mean, it's very deliberately done for an effect, and it's not
Yes.
a subtle application, but it is effective.
Well, this book isn't subtle.
Um,
Yeah.
I think if you have the book without that first scene, I don't know if that much is lost. I mean, it's just a blatant hook, right? To get you to think about, "Oh, you're wondering how I ended up in this place." You know? Like, is that really good writing? Like, the prose is good, but I contest the idea that it's good writing. I think it's actually lazy writing. I should say this. The point is the descent into chaos, how humanity deals with these pressure cooker situations. By giving away even a little bit of it, eating a dog, I think that actually devalues the journey. Like, I don't want the journey's conclusion given to me. I want to experience it without knowing that. So for me, I know what you're saying, Sam, because also didn't like it in the film, but I also didn't like it in the book. I think neither idea was well thought out. It doesn't actually add anything to the idea level. I think it also kind of ruins the structure a bit because you establish a kind of retrospective narration. Do we really want retrospective narration in this book? Because it shifts points of view to other characters. And by having a retrospective narration, you're establishing him as the main character. But as we talked about, that's not actually really what the book is about. It's about all of them. So yeah, I mean, I really actually take
Mm.
issue with it. I feel like I'm the only one who's critical of the book here, but I actually think like on a writing level, like the prose is really good, but besides that, there are a lot of issues that are quite common to mid-century sci-fi. It's actually better than a lot of mid-20th century sci-fi, but for example, the treatment of women, I am really mixed because I haven't read his other work, but I'm actually wondering, does he know how to write women? I really am wondering this because I think that you could always say, well, everyone's flat, but the women are more flat than the men. even though he's intelligent, I actually question whether or not he can write women, which is why I think even though I found the film to be just okay, I don't think it was that bad of an adaptation. Well, sorry, let me correct this. I don't think it's that bad as a work of art. I think as a work of art, it's okay. I think as an adaptation, it's quite bad. But, like, what is it on IMDb? Like maybe a 6 or something or a 5? Like that
Yeah.
feels about right to me. Whereas I would put this book at like a 6.57, maybe higher. So for me, when it comes to why it fails as an adaptation, I think there's a lot to talk about. But as a work of art, I don't think the movie is that far off. Would you recommend this film to anyone?
I,
I don't think
I
it's that bad. I think, if you were looking for a dystopian film, it's okay.
yeah, it's not the worst movie, but well, first I would only recommend it to people who hadn't read the book.
I think that's a big deal. Yeah, that's a big factor.
But even then, I don't know. The stylized nature of it goes a long way. I think that helps. But yeah, I
Well, I mean, is it possible to actually do this book justice? Is it possible to create a film that would satisfy people who like the book?
I don't know. I think Iad, you've pointed out before that some stories aren't meant for all media, and I think you could be right about that here. But I also hadn't thought of recontextualizing it to just be modern day or very near future. I think that could work, but the problem isn't necessarily even just the timeline for me. One of the biggest issues was the fractured storytelling that works well, I thought, in the book. And I think it would be tough to do well in the movie while still getting all of the ideas across. This movie already tries to streamline so many things because there's just not enough time.
I think that it's impossible. And I think the reason why it's impossible is because so much of the way that the book works is the character looking at something and thinking one thing about it, and then later looking at the same thing and thinking a different thought about it. And how do you get a shot of somebody looking at something and thinking about something and make that interesting in a film? I think it's just something that is outside of the medium of film. I think that it's just something that film cannot deal with.
Right. And that also goes to what I was saying before about the building being so central to our understanding of the book, where in the movie, objects aren't really important in the movie at all.
I think it could be possible, but you would have to have, I think, a much longer film. For me, the main issue is the pacing. If you were to show more things, show more interactions, I think you could get across a lot of the changes in perspective that you're talking about. But the problem is, like, does anyone actually want to watch, a 6-hour film?
Like, make it a mini series,
Yeah,
make
I
it,
mean, like, if we count that as the same medium, then it could work. That's what I'm saying is, like, as a film, like a self-contained film that we normally conceive of,
yeah.
something that lasts a couple of hours, I don't know. I think the time is the problem.
I don't even think that would work because when you get a shot of somebody feeling something, feeling sadness, feeling loneliness, you can
Yeah.
see that on their face. But to actually get a shot in a visual medium of somebody thinking something, it just doesn't seem like it would work. You could do it in a really cheesy way with a lot of voiceover narration or by inventing people writing diaries or something, but then it would be really corny.
Yeah, this movie already tries the voiceover, and there are movies that do voiceover well, but oof, I think they are very few and far between.
I think it depends on where we draw the line for a faithful adaptation. For me, I don't expect a faithful adaptation to encapsulate like 100% of the original text. I think if it captures enough of what the original text is going for, I'd say it's good enough. I would even categorize it as a good adaptation. So for me, it's not that I think film could capture everything that the book does, but I think that this film doesn't capture enough of what the book does. And I can conceive of a work that could capture enough of what this book is doing where I would say, yeah, this is a good adaptation. Like, it's good enough as an adaptation. It won't be the same as the book because obviously your method of consuming it is different, right? So you won't ever have the same experience. But I think the problem here is that the director and screenwriter, they just didn't capture enough of the book. All right. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our review, if you liked this movie and thought it was actually a good adaptation, go ahead and let us know on Reddit. You can find that link in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod if you'd like to reach out to us. If you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's in the episode description as well. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. We'll be back next week with an in-depth discussion of this novel and film, Highrise. If you're interested in joining our discussion, go ahead, find a copy of that book, and find the film. I watched it on Canopy. I don't know if it's on any other platforms, but in the US, you can get it on Canopy. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.